Good morning.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the INCT.DD, or as we call it, INCT.DD International Conference. It's a great honor to initiate this event, and we would like to thank everyone for the presence and the participation. First of all, I would like to say that my English is a bit rusty, and it was broken before that. That's the reason I'm reading this. We are now living in a period of serious concerns due to the coronavirus pandemic. That reality makes it even more important that we are here doing science and reaffirming its importance. And the challenges of organizing an event on digital democracy promoted by a leading research institute in discussions on digital politics, democracy, and government are even greater. For those who don't know us yet, we are the National Institute of Science and Technology for Digital Democracy, an institution that brings together several national and international research groups and laboratories dedicated to explore ways and means of using technology to produce more and better democracy. Our central laboratory and coordination is located at Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. Our team assembles over 50 researchers, including national and international professors. 39 institutions are involved in the project network, including universities, research centers, and laboratories. Second of all, to give the opening conference of the event, I would like to reinforce that I'm deeply honored and extremely happy to have Professor Stephen Coleman today. I can personally say that he's definitely the most kind, welcome, and brilliant person that I had the chance of meeting in England. And I'm very grateful to all his support to my research there. Before giving him the microphone, I just wanted to share a personal experience when I was leaving Leeds. You know, Professor Coleman and I had these weekly meetings where he suggested me some texts and I had the chance to discuss with him. At the time, I remember telling him that Brazil had a strong digital democracy research, and it was a perfect time to discuss democratic innovations. Back then, Brazil was in a much better context. For instance, the country was just about to host the Football World Cup, and we all know how it ended. And I mean the presence, not Germany, okay? But in those sessions, I tried to explain to Professor Coleman some of Wilson Gomes' ideas on e-democracy and political communication. And my desire was exactly a chance of here and then sharing ideas in the same Congress. It took a decade, but my wish was granted. With no further delay, I introduce you to Professor Stephen Coleman. Professor Coleman teaches political communication at the University of Leeds. He's also a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute. Over the past few decades, Professor Coleman has been leading researches in areas like political engagements, uses of digital media in representative democracies, forms of deliberation and decision making, among many others. Today, Professor Coleman will present his conference called Anger and Agency in the Digital Public Sphere. It's a pleasure to have you here, Professor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it would be an even greater pleasure to be in Brazil. I want to just say that Rafael was one of the great Brazilian scholars who have come to work with me in Britain, and there have been many, and I hope there will be many more. I want to argue today that democracy needs democratic agency more than it needs demonstrative anger, that the anger undermines the agency, that anger serves as a hollow surrogate for democracy. Agency entails a capacity to exercise control over one's life by acting upon the environment in a goal-directed manner. Hannah Arendt argued that democratic agency is rooted in intersubjective receptivity of the perspectives of others who do not share our position in the world, a capacity to form opinions by going amongst the opinions of others and exposing ourselves to them. And in the wonderful word that Arendt used, enabling our imaginations to go traveling. So how far is the contemporary public sphere, particularly the digital public sphere, from this ideal of multi-perspectival opinion formation? At the moment, all over the world, it is very far away. We are living at a time in which democracy is understood in terms of how we are not living. We live in an era in which angry political discourse has become the norm. Major nations are increasingly run by less than stable leaders who speak in capital letters and thrive on orchestrated outrage. The President of the United States, not for much longer, I hope, is so angry that he has to be connected throughout his waking hours to an anger machine called Twitter, into which leak dregs of bitterness that vitiate the public sphere. But indignation is not confined to the political elite. A 2018 Pew study asked social media users how the content they encountered tended to leave them feeling. The most overwhelming word that was used in response by 71% of respondents was angry. Another 2018 Pew analysis of congressional Facebook pages found that the anger emoticon is now the most common public response to posts by members of Congress. In the United Kingdom, the Committee on Standards in Public Life published a report last year in which they said, I quote, "Social media has sparked a step change in the abuse and intimidation of politicians and others in public life. The instantaneous and direct nature of communication online has shaped a culture in which the intimidation of candidates and others in public life has become widespread, immediate, and toxic." Well, I want to set out three arguments in my talk today. Firstly, that while there is abundant evidence to suggest that the digital media sphere is an angry place, it would be a mistake to conclude that the mood we are witnessing is a technological pathology, as if it was some kind of hardware or software or network design fault. My second argument is that anger is a manifestation of displaced agency. And my third argument is that realizing a less angry democratic discourse calls for radical changes in the forms of publicness. And this calls for a reimagination of the place of the public in the political domain. So let me start with angry social media. It is understandable that many commentators, including some scholars, have attempted to suggest that social media engender and exacerbate anger. There are two characteristics of digital media that seem to contribute to this affective contagion. The first is its platform structure, in which algorithmic prominence reflects the quantity rather than the quality of engagement and rewards negativity. So in other words, on your Facebook feed, it doesn't matter what people are saying, if you can provoke them to say something, then your algorithmic prominence increases. And of course, this rewards the most outrageous, the most flamboyant, the most offensive comments. The second problem of social media, scholars have pointed out, is its tendency to host ideologically homogeneous enclaves, which generate affective polarization. Not only the polarization of opinion and ideology, but the polarization of feeling and emotion, characterized by a dogmatic defensiveness in the face of opposition and an avoidance of information that challenges prevailing prejudices. So these two factors, platform structure and enclave homogeneity, have turned vast areas of the digital public sphere into wastelands of socially generated anger. And this tendency promotes four consequences that work against the normative objectives of democracy. The first is that democratic agency relies upon relatively unfiltered information processing. In other words, before you make your mind up about information, you have to process that information. But anger reduces the cognitive effort involved in that processing, encouraging careless thought and enabling people to rely on heuristic clues which lead them to make instant judgments, dominated by motivated reasoning and cognitive dissonance. That is to say, seeking an answer before one starts to consider the information and refusing to accept information that is dissonant with one's pre-existing beliefs. So that's the first of the problems working against normative democracy that social media presents, this tendency of anger to limit cognitive effort. The second normative problem is that democratic agency depends upon an openness to counter-argument. You want to achieve your goals, but you have to take into account the existence of people with other goals. But angry people tend to seek confirming information, and when faced with cognitively dissonant information, they respond to its sources confrontationally, accusingly, and sometimes in ways that make them appear less than human. Angry people are vulnerable then to high-risk strategies like populist politics, rooted in pernicious hostility and punitive notions of argumentative justice. So that's the second normative problem of anger in the digital public sphere. The third is that democratic agency is specifically goal-directed. You don't have generalized goals, you have specific goals as part of your existence as an autonomous political agent. But anger produces carryover effects to subsequent situations and judgments. It creates what we might call affective leakage and contamination, so that when you're angry in one situation, that anger goes over into all of the other situations that you are in, having a sort of network contagious effect. The fourth normative problem of anger in the digital public sphere is that democratic agency relies upon a realistic perception of one's ability to accomplish goals. But anger makes people indiscriminately optimistic about their chances of success. This is a very well-proven psychological finding, that angry people have a misplaced subjective sense of efficacy. It distorts that subjective efficacy by eliciting a defensive form of optimism, both in relation to self-efficacy, one's ability to influence the world, and political efficacy, the world's historical tendency to respond to what we think. Angry people have grandiloquent claims, grandiose claims, if you like, for their own efficacy. Now, I want to suggest that this last consequence of political anger is the most important one for the present pathologies of democracy and for the future of democracy. For it encourages a culture of false political confidence. It creates, in other words, a mass of angry citizens who are so confident in what they can do that they do not subject themselves to the normative checks and reflections that democratic agency need. By persuading people that shouting over other voices is the equivalent of winning an argument, that assembling large groups of like-minded prejudice is the same as the hard work of winning majority support, and that history can be made through the force of righteous indignation and facile sloganizing rather than by objective strategy, anger generates a beguiling delusion of power, which is precisely that. It is an intoxicating fantasy. Anger, then, is a response to constrained agency. Anger and agency are antithetical concepts. And that is the main argument of my lecture today, that this age of anger in which we find ourselves, in which political discourse is so commonly expressed through splutters of irritability within a lexicon of rancor, might also be characterized as an era of arrested agency. Being indignant is the most common contemporary form that people adopt when they encounter injustice. On the surface, it seems fierce and forceful, but in fact, it is an inadequate proxy for democratic agency. For rather than exercise anything resembling democratic agency, the rage being vented appears to be little more than a frustrated response to social forces that people feel are beyond their control. So they rant and they curse instead. So for all of their rhetoric about returning control to the left behind and the ordinary people, the populist splenetic narratives appeal to a plaintive trope of lost or stolen agency. Now, given the recent growth of populist anti-elite parties, not least, of course, in Brazil, which draw disproportionately from angry, formerly politically homeless citizens, I want to suggest that such parties operate by substituting anger for agency. They generate a form of pseudo-agency in 5 specific ways. Firstly, by radically simplifying political questions so that angry people can buy into interpretations, judgments, and plans without having to consider their feasibility. Secondly, by emphasizing stark contrasts and differences between parties and thereby making it seem as if the simple act of rejecting the mainstream is in itself an act of powerful agency. Thirdly, by translating diffuse frustrations about the social system into fantasies of remedial action. Fourthly, by stimulating an affective solidarity that serves as an emotional substitute for political efficacy. And finally, by dramatizing politics into an exciting gladiatorial contest in which expressive participation serves as a substitute for instrumental action. These populist policies are facilitated by the ease of online coordination and may indeed be exacerbated by features of social media platforms, but they are not in themselves digital effects. The eclipse of democratic agency is not a consequence of communication technology. The technology that is in need of repair is a political technology, and we call that technology democracy. And that is what I want to turn to talk to about in the remainder of my time. So to be clear, I am rejecting the fashionable view that social media are spaces of affective contagion. This view, I argue, emanates from discredited media effects theory. Imagining that terrorists, racists, misogynists, misanthropes have found through the internet a new freedom to set the tone of political discourse misses the point that messages are impotent unless they are positively received by people. Trump's crazy tweets do not create the self-righteous fury of angry white bigots. They appeal to it. For as Zizi Papakarisi suggests in her really astute study of affective circulation, hashtags, I quote, serve as empty signifiers that invite ideological identification on a polysemic orientation. In other words, it is not that political feeling is formed and then disseminated, but that through the process of circulation, feelings come to be formed. Indeed, to form a binding collective feeling is to assemble something called a public. So Papakarisi is right to refer to these as affective publics, characterized by shared feelings of belonging and solidarity, however fleeting or permanent those feelings might be. The long-term consequences of creating a political environment in which anger is the dominant tone are deeply damaging to three democratic norms: solidarity, which binds us together and not against; deliberation, which enables us to work through arguments and not talk over them; and representation, which enables us to be spoken with rather than demagogically spoken for. So seeking to change the enraged tone of contemporary democracy is more than a mere ethical or ascetic ambition. It should not be understood as a pious call to citizens to be nicer to each other, to adopt more deliberative norms, to do something kind in the future. Rather, it entails a willingness and a commitment to reimagine radically what constitutes political form. That's the word that I want to focus on for a moment: form. By form, I mean the cluster of core features that configure patterns of practice and experience into determinate social entities. So, for example, governing is a social practice, but government assumes a particular form characterized by structural norms which are cultivated in their own right, separately from the contingencies of practice. Practices of governing are expected to adhere to the formal norms of government. So rethinking how we do politics involves confronting tensions between the forms of being political that have assumed ontological privilege over time and the practices of acting politically that emerge and evolve through creative acts of agency. I think this is what John Dewey, the great American philosopher, meant when he said, I quote, "To form itself, the public has to break existing political forms." It's a really, really interesting and incidentally under-discussed comment by Dewey. To form itself, the public has to break existing political forms. What does this mean? Social scientists and especially political scholars tend to speak of the public as if it is an already formed entity, an aggregate body that can be relied upon to play certain roles. Dewey's argument was that for the public to exercise agency, it must resist the formal functions that are ascribed to it by others and create its own practices of acting politically. And that is precisely where the internet and social media becomes a laboratory of creativity. And empirically, we can see it is a space of experimentation in which citizens work out how they want to be perceived, represented, and agentic as a public. In the context of social media publics, this entails refusing to be cast in the role as a knee-jerk, angry mob. Rather than accepting the form of digital political space on the terms that it is offered to us, there's a need to break such forms and to use a Brechtian term, to refunction them for a more democratic environment. So refunctioning the forms of publicness is one of the great objectives, I would argue, of the democratic process and scholarship around the internet. Breaking with political formalism entails rejecting the thinly institutionalist and proceduralist characterization of democracy that has been particularly fostered by neoliberal ideology. It is not because politicians sit in parliaments or congresses, or because there are elections between rival candidates every few years, or because citizens are free to curse the government on Facebook, that democracy can be said to exist. Democracy might be secured through constitutional mechanisms, but it is not formed by them. The foundational gesture of democracy is the intersubjective coming together of citizens within whatever forms of mutual presence they are able to generate. Once again, returning to Hannah Arendt, she famously stated that democratic publics emerge when people appear before one another, where I appear to others as others appear to me. The question that preoccupies Arendt and preoccupies me now is not about how citizens can realize their role as members of a pre-constituted public of Americans, of workers, of Brazilians, of blacks, of whites, but as a people finding their own creative ways of making their appearance to one another through becoming public. So from a normative perspective, there can be few more important contemporary challenges than to explore the various forms in which the public realm, and by implication the public itself, can organize itself and be organized. Our current crisis of agency raises a formidable challenge for us as researchers who care about the health of the democracies that we study. It requires us to rethink our almost fetishized acceptance of political practices that have become ossified within obsolete forms dominated by slick marketing and cynical manipulation. It calls for a normative abandonment of the lazy assumption that the best we can hope for from politics is an unchecked anger fest. The challenge then is to reimagine spaces of political communication as if humans were capable of more than shouting at one another, a project that my great colleague, now 96 years old, Jay Blumler, and I worked on in our proposal for an online civic commons. So to conclude, how can this happen? What can scholars do to encourage this new publicness, this breaking of forms, this coming of agency? For a start, democracy requires a new discourse architecture that maximizes extensive social connectivity. It needs to be able to expose online information seekers to unsought news and knowledge, to encourage citizens to transcend homophilic silos by engaging in cross-cutting discussions. It needs to ensure that elected representatives are driven by the informed and reflective demands of citizens. And it needs to be able to work through problems rather than falling back on knee-jerk ideology. In my new book, How People Talk About Politics, I have argued that democracy needs a new way to talk. And this incidentally is a phrase I borrowed from Harold Laswell, who used it in 1941 in a memorable chapter called Democracy Needs a New Way to Talk. In my book, I've set out what needs to happen for our culture of political talk to mature beyond its infantilized obsession with screeching. This is a normative argument for reimagining the form of democracy rather than an empiricist lament about the awfulness of the existing digital public sphere. We can't make the internet go away, even if we wanted to, but we can change the form of democracy. It is in our hands. We can nurture practices for occupying the internet differently. And I hope that this conference, run by this great institute that you have in Brazil, will endeavor to do just that by addressing 3 questions. Yes, I'm leaving you with questions, not with answers. And they are: how can digital media become a more accountable kind of public space? Secondly, how can digital media help its users to become a better kind of public? Thirdly, how can agency displace anger by offering people more durable, effective, and material rewards for trying to make a difference than engaging in the fantasies of populist anger? I've ended with questions, and it is my hope that this conference will undertake the hard work of answering them. Everything that I have said today is normatively framed because we are in a position of unstable and highly challenged democratic norms. The task ahead of us is to refashion them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Coleman. Now we are open for questions. We only have one from Cristiano Ferri. And it's nice because Ferri was, let's say, the main head of Brazilian e-democracy project in the parliament. And he's actually asking a very practical question. Because you are talking about the need of appearance to one another. You have always talked about horizontal ways of communication, that democracy needs a new way to talk, of making digital media more accountable. So Ferri is asking, Professor Coleman, do you believe that regulating social media platforms is part of the solutions of these problems? And what kind of regulation would that be? Tatiana Maria Dorado, that is also from the INCT, is asking, what do you think about the role of interpersonal conversation or bigger personal connection and interaction to shape this angry digital public sphere? I guess now we only have those two
Well, they're really good questions, so thank you for asking them. I think the first thing before one talks about regulation is definition. I think the key question for us is that we haven't, as a society, defined what social media are. Are they, as I think many people tend to think, a form of broadcasting and publishing? If they are, then of course you can't regulate some forms of publishing and not others. So they have to be accountable. And because they already are accountable to some extent, because many of the laws of accountability that relate to the press also relate to the internet, but some don't. And then there is a question of, if some don't, to what extent can you make those regulatory regimes extend to the internet without losing the horizontal vitality of the internet? But then there is another model, another metaphor, if you like, and that is that the internet is essentially a kind of a vast global telephone system or postal system. And of course, we've never tried to regulate what people do on the telephone. When people phone each other up, they can threaten to kill each other. They can certainly threaten to kill world leaders. And nobody comes along and says, you are therefore breaking the law. Nobody says you can't spread misinformation in a letter to your friends. And of course, what we have to do is to deal with the definitional question. Now, I think that one of the ways of doing that, and I think it's a massive problem, and lawyers will deal with it, and philosophers will deal with it. What we can contribute to that is by going at the other end and looking at the institutional input. So I think that the regulation that is very often needed is by the political institutions that are engaged in the political internet. So, for example, parliaments are a really good example. Is the job of parliament essentially to use the internet as just another form of broadcasting? Or do you use the internet as a form of creating essentially a global or a national telephone system in which citizens can talk about how they are being represented? That, I think, is the most important question for this question of form to be considered. What parliaments do, what governments do, what local councils do is not the same now as it was when they were invented at a time when people used to have to travel on horses for hours on end to get to them. It's not like that anymore, but they haven't moved on. Look, your second question, I think, is an absolutely key question. Randall Collins once wrote that, that there is no such thing as data. Every data starts with a datum. And the datum of democracy is the conversation. It's interpersonal talk. Because what you're seeing on Facebook in its millions and millions of occasions every day is a form of interpersonal talk, or an attempt to replicate interpersonal talk. And one of the reasons that the book I have just published, How People Talk About Politics, is so strange, some people I think will criticize it, is that I don't talk very much about the internet. I talk about face-to-face discussion. Because unless we can get face-to-face discussion normatively clear and normatively secure and confident, and I think confident is the key word, then what we do with technologies is not going to make any difference, because the technologies will replicate the bad temper that exists on the ground at the micro level. So the micro-macro link is an absolutely key one for us to understand if we are going to take on the big structures like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. These are, in fact, institutional macro manifestations of what is essentially a micro practice.
Okay. Now we have tons of questions. Good. I'm going to ask you in groups of 3, I guess. Mm-hmm. First, Fernando Filgueiras, he's thanking for your presentation, and he's asking modern regulation. What kind of institutions do you imagine to democratize the digital world? Marco Konapaki, he's also thanking you. Considering institutions and representatives tend to preserve the status quo for their own sake, in your view, who might start this institutional change? Mm-hmm. And I have a question myself that I guess it's connected to those two. Yeah. That in previous works of yours, you said a lot about listen. What was government listening? What did it mean? And I would like to hear you about if listening to the public is still some role that the governments need to fulfill. Because when we look at this moment, for instance, Bolsonaro or Trump, we are not very encouraged to say to those guys to listen to the people, because actually, in a very pragmatical way, they can listen to these angry people and foster these conservative and even anti-democratic agendas, and still call them as legitimate because he consulted the people. And I would like to hear about this. So it's something about what are those institutions that you are imagining and what we can do now, right now.
Yeah,
I think it's something like that.
Thank you. Well, wonderful questions. I think I'd like to stay all day. Let me begin with the institutional question. It's a very important. Institutions are important, and building them is hard work, and that is why when Jay Blumler and I started work on this in our book, The Internet and Democratic Citizenship, at the end of the 1990s, we decided that we wanted to propose an institutional arrangement. We called this the Civic Commons. And we said that this should be an independent public service body, the job of which was to enable people to use digital technologies to talk to each other across communities and across differences of opinion, but also to talk to their elected representatives. And their elected representatives have a duty to be responsive to this. And I can tell you something, that in the early 2000s, there was some take-up for this idea, political take-up at a national level in various places. And in every single one of them, it didn't get to the point of implemented policy. But it is still, as far as I'm concerned, on the table, because it is we have to learn from previous media. And one of the things we know is that the public service model of organizing media has a normative advantage for the least heard people, for those voices that are most likely to be excluded from elite deliberations. And we have to make sure that that norm of inclusion is part of any democratic settlement. So I still stand by that. And if you read the final chapter of the book, The Internet and Democratic Citizenship, I don't want to move away from that at all. But the questioner is right to say representative institutions ossify and they want to retain what power they have. And in my relatively recent book, Can the Internet Strengthen Democracy?, I take the example of the British Parliament's Commission on digital democracy, which was advised by a Brazilian scholar, incidentally, in which they came up with a set of plans that allowed everything except for their own power to be affected by any kind of democratic technology. And this was very regrettable. And I went into some detail to explain that. But here's the argument I would put to these representative institutions. I would say to them, you don't have a choice between the status quo and this more inclusive and accountable form of democracy. You have a choice between the increasing irrelevance of what you are doing and a changed form of democracy. In other words, what we are proposing is not some sort of utopian message. It is a means of putting out a fire. We think that the problem is that governments have ceased to be able to govern efficiently, and the public have come to believe that governments don't know how to listen, and governments have come to believe that the public don't know how to speak. And that creates such a damaging situation that the relationships of politics are toxic. So this then comes to your final excellent question, Rafael, about listening. And of course, it is key, and it is one of the three elements of a revived democracy that I write about in this new book. Listen, what do we mean by listening? Well, representation is entirely, if you go back to the key works on representation, and I would recommend to everyone The Concept of Representation by Hannah Pitkin, in which representation is a process of listening to people and formulating what they would want to say themselves in terms that can be implemented. Now, what we have, and Bolsonaro is a perfect example of this, so is Trump, is a failure of representation and its replacement by projection. So projection is when I listen to you, you disagree with me, and I repeat back to you your disagreement in terms of agreement with me. And this is exactly how the populist demagogues operate. They operate in a world of fantasy where they imagine that the crowd they're talking to is a mirror reflection of themselves. But in fact, it's a projection. And this is, of course, why Trump loves his rallies so much amongst his base. Because when he addresses them, he speaks into this kind of echo where he hears back them saying to him what he is saying to them. That's not listening. That is a rather pathological form of projection. Listening is hard work because of two reasons. One, we are in an attention economy. In other words, you can't listen to everything. You can't listen, if someone's listening to me now, they're not listening to something else that's perhaps as worthwhile somewhere else. So you can't read all the books at the same time. You go into a library not to read all the books, but one of the books. Therefore, attention has got to be distributed. And how you distribute it should be on the basis of people's own agency of determining what they want and not just what they get. In other words, it's not a consumerist or a market-led process. The second reason that listening is hard work is that it is different from simple hearing. I can hear what you say, but I cannot listen always to why you are saying it. Going back to interpersonal conversation, one of the reasons that conversations end so badly in the domain of politics is that people listen to what people say, but not to who they are. And very often when I interviewed a large number of people about the Brexit debate, and I asked them, what were your conversations about? And not one of them was about Brexit. It was about, who does he think he is to tell me that I'm wrong? Because I come from a working class and he's a snob. He's a man and I'm a woman. He's not lived my life. He comes from the South and I live in the North. How could someone from the South know what I'm like? Do you see what I mean? Listening involves a biographical sensibility for the other person. And this takes practice. It's a cultural change. It's hard work. You can't legislate it into existence, but you can bring it into existence by shaming those who do not practice it.
Great. I guess last round of questions, okay?
Yes.
Regina Luna is continuing this kind of official communication. So she asks, what are your comments on what could go wrong when the government choose to use the social media as official channels or the channels. Would a tweet be acceptable for any agency? And the next questions, I guess, they address more this idea of reimagining the public. Camilo Ajo is asking, he's talking about this last book of Benkler, Ferris, and Roberts, where they argue that we are living in an epistemic crisis in the democratic world, and maybe we are losing some common ground that enable us to behave as a public. If you agree on their ideas. Alexandre Teles is asking these social media companies' role to build a better online environment. He's insisting on this idea. And Divan Azevedo, who's also from INCT, is asking a very good philosophical question: if the public is prepared to assume this role, and above all, if the public wants to assume this agent's role.
Yeah.
And we have no, I think Wilson Gomes is just saying some stuff. Vitor Chagas, just to finish then. Vitor Chagas from INCT is asking, when Papacharici wrote about the concept of affective publics, she was referring to recent mass demonstrations like the Arab Spring. Today we are dealing with reactionary audiences. Isn't this turning point what makes us concerned with the idea of demagogy, not as affective publics themselves? In other words, we were still in the midst of mass demonstration of the beginning of the last decade. Wouldn't we be praising the inclusion of these new audiences? You can see in the comments, you see the comments bar, and if you want to see the questions once again. And I thank everyone that's participating and sending questions.
Okay, right. How many hours have I got to reply to this? Okay. I think the first question, what could go wrong? We have to be sensitive to form. I mean, the tweet is invented. Twitter was invented to create a platform for a particular kind of expression. And we need to understand, and institutions need to understand, the difference between different forms of expression. I mean, if you want to compete with television, you make YouTube. If you want to create a sustainable network, you might go to Facebook. If you want to say something in very few words that is somewhere between a slogan and a provocation, then you might go to Twitter. But I think, you know, this is something people have got to be very careful about. And the corporate sector have sort of gone to the wrong places for these things very often as well. They try to assume that because something is popular, you can get any message across there. It doesn't work like that. So again, this is exactly what I'm talking about when I speak about form. We need to think about the forms that we are dealing with. I think we are in an epistemic crisis, but I don't think we're in an epistemic crisis because people have given up on reason and rationality. I think we are in it because they have been manipulated. And I think it's an incredibly difficult conversation to have. Hillary Clinton kind of got into that conversation during the last US election, which is that if you call out demagogues for what they are actually doing, which is taking advantage of people who are vulnerable, then you appear to be condescending and attacking those people. I think it's necessary to do so. The reality is we don't have an equally educated society. We don't have a society in which everybody is as capable as everybody else of cognitively processing what is thrown at them. And demagogues take advantage of that. Hence the very famous comment from Donald Trump at one of his rallies. I love uneducated people. Of course he loves uneducated people. And there is a reason for it. So there is an epistemic crisis, but a lot of it is in fact an exploitation of a vulnerability that has existed over a number of decades, long before the internet, is a consequence of mass culture, but has a countervailing trend, which is the desire, the autodidactic desire to learn, to educate your children, to want to be reasonable. And that's there as well. And that relates to a question that was asked about, does the public want democratic agency? I answer it this way. I try to study what's going on in the world. I've never yet heard of a riot in any country occurring because people are listened to too much. I've never heard of anybody going out on the street and saying, you know, we are so tired of politicians asking us for our opinion and including us and talking to us. We're going to go and smash the parliament down. It always seems to happen the other way. So I have to go on the basis of the historical evidence, which is there is a huge human democratic appetite for democracy, not always for the tedious parts of institutional democracy, but certainly for the desire at a moral level to have some kind of collective role in the most important decisions that affect people, what Nancy Fraser calls parity of participation. It's a really interesting question about whether we would be having the same conversation now had the right-wing demagogues not been winning the day so often. Well, I hope in a few days' time we might then change the conversation on that basis, because maybe one right-wing demagogue will be exchanging his presidential suite for a prison cell. But one of the things that we have to think about is indeed what the role of affect is in democratic politics. And I've argued over a number of years that it is incredibly important. It's not a supplement to cognitive epistemology. It is the other side of cognition. That is to say, there is no duality between affect and knowledge. And furthermore, that knowledge that is not affectively framed is probably knowledge that is useless. The final question is in relation to the companies. No, I think the companies will resist many of the things that we are talking about. I don't believe that the job of digital democrats is to appeal to Facebook to do the right thing. I think the only way that democratic changes have ever happened in any country, whether it has been civil rights or whether it has been the enfranchisement of women, it has happened when the people themselves who are affected decide that they have had enough of being excluded from power. I think we're in a very interesting position in relation to that being a possibility. It's a frightening position because on one level, we could move into a 1930s trajectory, but at the same time, we could move into a trajectory in which people learn fast from what have been very bad mistakes. And it may well be that the decade we have just gone through will in fact prove to be a period in which creative ideas have been incubated.
Okay, thank you very much. João, I don't think we have more questions. Antonio Claret, Professor Coleman, thanks for this enlightening conference. Given the already existing political polarization and anger associated to it, which strategies could be applied to overcome it? Rodrigo Carreiro is thinking something that it's nice, that do you think scholars were too optimistic about digital democracy back in the 90s. We have some discussions about that in some different Congress, when we are not among colleagues, direct colleagues, for example, when we are dealing with colleagues from political communication, they ask something like that, why are you still studying digital democracy? We don't have even a good democracy anymore. So what is the point? What is the whole of the concept, of the idea of digital democracy when you live in such a troublesome moment? I think we are hoping for hope.
Yeah. Let me answer that. If you could just put up the first question as well. I didn't make a note of that first question that somebody asked, but let me go to Rodrigo's question, because it is, of course, very relevant. I was there in the 1990s, so if there is blame, the arrow should point at me. I think much of this work was driven by a certain kind of optimism. You have to remember that when some of us were first writing about the internet, we were up against the argument that the internet was an ephemeral fashion. It was going to disappear. I mean, this may sound really strange now, but I cannot tell you the number of talks I gave in the 1990s to people who said, don't you remember citizen band radio in the 1980s? They said, this is going to be the same. It will go. I remember a leading politician in Britain after 1997, when the Blair government came to power, who said, he said to me, how many people use the internet in Britain? And I don't know whether you remember, but in 1998, 2% of British people had access to the internet. So I said 2%. And he said, and I'll take out the swear words, but he said, why the hell should we study or think about a technology that 98% of people don't have access to? And I said, because I think that in 5 years' time, the majority of the population will be using it. So we were optimistic in the sense that we studied something that we thought was going to have a massive influence. I remember feeling quite embarrassed, actually. I went to give evidence to a parliamentary committee at the House of Commons, and they said to me, how do you regard the significance of the internet? This was in 1999. And I said, I think it's as important as the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. And they all started to laugh. I mean, I sat there and I felt embarrassed, because I thought, maybe I've said something stupid. I think I was right. I remember, again, I'm getting all these things off my chest now. I remember in the 2001 election, I wrote an article about the role of the internet in the 2001 election. The leading opinion pollster in Britain, Bob Worcester, wrote in a book on the 2001 election. He said, Stephen Coleman says the internet played an important role. We'll see. That was his word. We'll see. Well, we have seen. I went back and told him last time I saw him. I said, yes, we see. The internet is now significant. So we were optimistic in that sense. If you mean, were we normatively optimistic? Well, I don't call myself an optimist, but I am a normative theorist. I am engaged in my work not because I like numbers. I don't want to count, the number of websites that exist. I don't count hits. I don't. I choose what I focus on, and I focus on it because for me, democratic life is a commitment, not simply an object of study. And from that point of view, I never liked the term cyber optimist and cyber pessimist. I still teach. And when my students write essays and they say, oh, there are the cyber pessimists and there are the cyber optimists, I say, look, what are you talking about? I mean, it's like talking about science and saying there are the science pessimists and the science optimists. You don't do something unless you have a certain belief that there's a value in it. But it is not, I think that, I mean, look, there were some terrible books written in the 1990s. To finish my answer, there was a book by a guy called Dick Morris, who used to be Bill Clinton's chief political advisor, in which he said, everything is going to go online. We're going to all end up we won't have governments, we won't have parliaments, we'll have direct democracy, we'll press our button every morning and decide whether there's going to be a war in the Middle East. There was Negroponte's work. There was a certain amount of that. I think I'm more worried about where we are now. When I go to conferences now, I keep meeting people who, now that this has become a more established field, have made their careers out of talking about why nothing works. I don't particularly find them interesting. I find that sometimes they're right about where we are now, but they take us no further than that empiricist observation.
Okay. The question was, given the already existing political polarization and the anger associated to it, which strategies could be applied to overcome it? And there's a new question: what kinds of international alliances or coalitions could help us strengthening the digital public sphere, globally speaking? What roles do you see Brazil playing in those alliances? From Caio Werneck.
Great questions. Okay, so sorry, I missed the question about polarization. You're quite right. It depends whether you think this polarization is entrenched or fragile. I think it's fragile. I'm not comparing these things, let me be very clear, but if you look at what happened, for example, in Germany after 1945, the process of anger being pacified was much faster than people imagined. And if you look, for example, at other countries, Rwanda comes to mind, where there have been huge anger-generated hostilities, there is a movement away from that when people, as it were, are able to take in fresh air. And I think that what we are dealing with is a need for strategies of reasonable talk. I think that what is needed from us is not an attempt to outshout the shouters, but to have better arguments than them, to have better facts than them. And that's why, and this comes to the international coalition, it is so important that centers like yours exist and that others do around the world, because what you are doing, you are engaged in both a scholarly project, but what is implicitly, I would say, a democratic project. And it is very, very important that these things are globalized. And one of the things I would like to be involved in is helping to create that sort of international network. I think we have a need for that. We have the Association of Internet Researchers, of course, but that is primarily academic. We have some gatherings of people who are media practitioners, but what we need is a civic-based set of connections. And I think that is something. And what role Brazil, look, you may or may not know it, but Brazil, for those of us who work in this area, Brazil has always been seen as one of the great hopes in this area, partly because of what I said at the beginning. You've produced so many scholars, you have so many established people like Wilson Gomez, who have contributed to global knowledge in this area. It's a very, very important country in all of this. And it's also one of the interesting things that when I was going around Europe in the early part of the 21st century and various governments, what you found was that it wasn't always in the obvious places that the most interesting things were happening. So, for example, you would go to Spain and very little was happening. You go to Portugal, a lot was happening. You know, you would go to Belgium, not much happening. You would go to the Netherlands, a lot was happening. You go to Mexico, not so much. Brazil, a lot. I mean, that was then. I'm not saying it's the case now. What I'm saying is that I think that there is a very, very important role for us all to play in having conversations like this, having joint projects, working together. I mean, I don't want to embarrass him, but we wrote an article, he mainly, of course, did the hard work with Rafael on participatory budgeting when he was in Leeds. This has been a way of helping the discussion about participatory budgeting in a number of other countries. So these collaborations really help because they give us access. I worked 2 years ago with another brilliant Brazilian scholar, João. And you know, these have been wonderful collaborations, and we must continue with them.
Thank you very much for your kindness, Professor. I guess we could finish one question from Wilson Gomes himself. You can see the comment sidebar here.
Yes.
It's a long question. Wilson Gomes, he is saying that Professor Coleman completely agree with your idea that seeking to change the enraged tone of contemporary democracy is more than the mere ethical or ascetic ambition. But you characterize this sentiment simply as anger. While those who seek to manipulate such feelings into their agendas never speak of anger or hatred, but of moral indignation, ethical rage, don't you think it's much easier to make a normative speech against anger or hate, which is negative, than against this moral outrage and ethical fury that, I mean, these conservative and populist politicians are using this argument against us?
Yeah.
That they are not fostering the anger themselves. They are just to stand for the people.
Yeah. Very interesting question, and obviously it deserves a much longer answer than I'm able to give it. But I want to say that I speak about anger because it is a primary emotion. It is a primary emotion like fear, and it enables us to measure something. It enables us to deal with something specific. But you're of course quite right. I mean, angry people never say that what they are trying to spread is anger. People never, you know, it's people don't call anger. They call it ethical indignation. They call it the righteousness of a great cause. I go back to what I said about interpersonal communication, that interpersonal communication is biographical and political movements are biographical as well. That is to say, what makes a group of people susceptible to a message is the emotional state that their life circumstances have put themselves in. They've been hurt. They feel neglected. They feel their voices haven't been heard. They feel embarrassed. Sometimes they feel ashamed. And what is the emotion that enables them to deal with that? There is a range of emotional options. If you are embarrassed and shamed and neglected, one option is to assert power, is to say, I don't. This is unjust. I don't want this. It is to blame those who have treated you that way. But another way is to suffuse everything that you do and say by a kind of anger. And so when I criticize anger, I am not criticizing people's professed reasons for taking a position. I am criticizing the psychological effect that enables this to become forceful. That's what I want to get at. I long believed that, you know, populism is not only dangerous, but it is also incredibly unjust from the point of view of what its followers need. I am no enmity to populists. Populist people who follow populist ideology are people who want to grab on to something. I remember doing a focus group some years ago where I had a group of fascists. They just turned out to be supporters of the neo-Nazi British National Party. At the end of the focus group, I wanted to go up to them and take them out for a drink in the local pub. I was on their side. I was concerned about their feelings. I realized they were lonely. They needed someone to talk to. They needed to get off their chest what had happened to them. And I agree with you, Wilson, that we must not construct an argument that denies people's reasons for anger. But it is anger that is manifest here. It is anger that we are actually dealing with. And anger is a form of arrested agency. And you cannot have agency and anger operating coexistently. The only way that you can intensify agency is by getting rid of its proxy. And so this surrogate agency is in fact a means of keeping people away from power. That is my argument. It's a longer argument to have, and I very much look forward to continuing that discussion with you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Coleman. I guess we could finish here. We don't have any more questions. So in behalf of all INCT members, I really thank you for your conference, for taking those questions. And we hope to collaborate more in the future in this.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I've enjoyed it, and as always, when I speak, it forced me to have to think about what I want to say and what might be meaningful. And I hope that some of what I said was meaningful. And I certainly hope that I will get to have face-to-face conversations with you. And please feel free to write to me at my email address, any of you, if you have points that you would like to develop further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we hope that you have the chance of coming to Brazil in the next years.
So do I.
Not have a pandemic anymore. And to all people that are watching us, remember that we have a session, a private session in the afternoon. And the next days, we are going to see a lot of round tables with another professors along the week. Thank you very much to everyone.